Anna Kasparian of the Young Turks recently went on CNN to talk a little bit about the most recent Democratic debate, and it ended up becoming a really interesting discussion about the differences between the progressive wing and the centrist wing of the party. So I want to show you a clip of that, then we're going to come back and talk about it.
There is a lot of policy differences they should be discussing in terms of how to achieve goals that they all agree upon, and that's healthy. But when it descends into personal attacks and slander, then, of course, we saw what happened in 2016, and it's very hard, if not impossible, to come together afterwards. And that's why I think we've got to be very careful as Democrats, as activists, as progressives, to make sure we keep our focus on the issues and not on the personal attacks. And one of the things that concerns me most were the personal attacks around fundraising, which were ultimately false and very divisive. I think if you saw in the earlier contest, when Democrats got too personal in their attacks, really the rank and file resented it and rejected it, because the focus has to be to unite to defeat Donald Trump and focus on issues that really matter to people's lives. That's why it was very encouraging to hear Bernie Sanders also make the call for party unity and stress that we're all going to stand together against Donald Trump. So I think it's an encouraging sign. And let's face it, this is going to get a lot more intense. And as we watch the primary results, keep an eye who finishes third place. I think that will be the person with momentum going forward. But it's the sense of unity here. It's unusual for us, but it's encouraging to see.
So Anna, at the debate last night, Senator Amy Klobuchar was the only candidate to, kind of jump at the chance, respond to the question when asked about who was concerned about having a Democratic socialist at the top of the Democratic ticket. Listen.
Is anyone else on the stage concerned about having a Democratic socialist at the top of the Democratic ticket?
Bernie and I work together all the time, but I think we are not going to be able to outdivide the divider in chief.
So Anna, what did that mean? What did that say that Amy Klobuchar was willing to answer that question and in that manner?
I think it just means that Amy Klobuchar, to her credit, continues to be authentic and honest about the positions that she holds. She does not want to push for real structural change that Bernie Sanders wants. She wants to go in the more moderate lane. And I think that she has positioned herself as someone who's way more authentic than Pete Buttigieg when it comes to that brand of politics. However, if you look at the polling, even though Bernie Sanders has had an incredibly consistent message regarding the policies that he's championing, it hasn't hurt him in any way. It's only helped him. And it's because if you take the labels away and just focus on what he's proposing for the American people, they like his policies. It's extremely popular. That's why you have Pete Buttigieg proposing Medicare for all who want it, because he realizes that Medicare for all is incredibly popular, but he knows that he doesn't actually support Medicare for all. He wouldn't push for real reform in our healthcare system.
Let's be clear about this, Anna. All these candidates are advocating real reform. And while they have different approaches to getting there, they're all committed to expanding health care for all Americans. And I think we have to be very clear about understanding that while we may have differences with them, they're all committed to structural change, dramatic change, and especially from what we represent in the White House. But I think we have to be very careful about making sure we don't descend into personal attacks. For example, Sanders' attack on Pete Buttigieg.
I don't think that was a personal attack. I mean, Amy Klobuchar has been clear. She's been clear in saying, you know what, I'm the pragmatic candidate. I'm not going to promise you anything. And look, to her credit, the fact that she's incredibly authentic resonates
By the way,
with people.
that's just incorrect, Anna. You can be pragmatic and also advocate structural change.
I think that you have a misconception about what she's promising the American people.
All right. Look, this guy is a complete and clear hack. I don't know if you caught it there, but one of the things which he said was keep an eye on the person who finishes third because that's going to be the person with momentum. Okay, that tells you straight away that this guy's a hack. He's there to promote an agenda. So let me show you who is ultimately coming in third. So this is the RCP average for New Hampshire. So if you look here, Bernie Sanders up at the top, Buttigieg coming in second. Buttigieg really did seem to surge with the Iowa, with the Iowa results doing at least better than he expected, although there's good evidence to suggest that there was some weird stuff going on for sure. But regardless, he is taking a bump up in the polls. So third is either Warren or Biden or possibly Klobuchar. So basically what he's saying is, oh, the only real person with any kind of clear momentum going forward is going to be one of the centrist establishment candidates. And he is, to be fair, conceding that Buttigieg probably doesn't have a clear path towards the nomination, likely because of his poor support among Latinos and among African Americans. I mean, you really can't win a Democratic primary with like 5% of African American support. I don't even think it's that. I think that was like his best poll or something like that. Whereas Bernie Sanders is doing really well among African Americans and especially among Latinos. Obviously, Joe Biden still does hold the lead among African Americans, but Bernie Sanders is closing that lead fast. In fact, there was some recent polling coming out of South Carolina showing Bernie Sanders surging up really well into South Carolina. We'll have to see if Bernie Sanders is able to carry forward that momentum. But on to the next part of this discussion here. One of the points which he says is which was, in my opinion, really laughable, is he accuses Bernie Sanders of doing kind of character attacks when it comes to campaign finance, which, by the way, is the same accusation which Christy Smith levels against Cenk Uygur in California's 25th congressional district. She says, hey, look, it's a personal attack if you try to attack me on taking corporate money because you're accusing me of being bought, that I'm just paid for. And look, here's the thing with that. Even if it's the case that your genuine views align perfectly with this corporation who's giving you money, it's still corrupting to democracy, because if that company gives you money, that corporation gives you that money, then ultimately it becomes more difficult for other Democratic challengers in your district to oppose you, because money makes you more able to win an election, right? So if the corporations are genuinely, if say for instance, the corporations aren't trying to buy you and all they wanted to do was just give money to people who agreed with them, it's still a problem. It's still a problem because they're, in a sense, still looking for a return on investment, and damn sure they're still going to get it, even if the politicians' genuine views are aligned with that with that corporation. But honestly, that's not my view. I do think that a lot of politicians come in here, they want to be career politicians, especially like Buttigieg, right? They want to, continue winning re-election, and so they might change their views or reframe an issue in order to, get that money, in order to cuddle up to that money. So I don't believe that it's not, in a sense, a character attack, that it's not, in a sense, an indictment on their character that they are taking money. But regardless, even if we were to ignore that, it's still a problem. So that's why when Bernie Sanders turns around and accuses Buttigieg of having 40 billionaire donors, it's a legitimate policy criticism. It's not just some kind of character attack coming out of the ether. It's a real criticism. It's a legitimate criticism. And the fact that centrists can't recognize that as a legitimate criticism just shows you their ultimate ideological blinders. That they can't see that taking money from corporations is a problem and that it is corrupting to democracy. So no, I don't agree with this absolute hack Zimmerman saying that this is a kind of character attack, that this is going to divide up the party. No, if anything, this is going to unite the party, because what's not popular? Corruption. You know what is a winning message? Saying, hey, look, I'm going to take on the parties and I'm ultimately going to fight for you, and I'm not going to cuddle up to corporations. That is a winning message. So no, it's not even divisive. I don't even agree with him on that premise. So look, I think I made it clear at the beginning. This guy's a hack, but he's a hack through and through and through. He's a corporate hack. But regardless, on to the next point. One of the clips there, it shows Klobuchar, and she's talking about the center. Now, this actually goes to one of the more recent changes which we've seen in campaign dynamics recently. So Matthew Dowd, it was a sort of campaign consultant manager, and he's kind of famous right now, at least in sort of academia, because one of the studies which he conducted is he looked at data from around 2000 and looked at like the past 5 or 6 election cycles, and found that the number of what he calls persuadable independents went down from 22% to 7%. So what does he mean by persuadable independents? Because that's clearly the key term. By that, he means someone who, is an independent, registered as an independent, and then comes out to vote, and then might vote Democrat, might vote Republican, might go the other way. Now it was 7%, and now actually it's probably even a little bit lower now, because that was a couple years ago. But my point, though, is no longer, if it ever was the case, no longer is it the case that the best campaign strategy, the best way to win a national election, especially, is to try to move to the center and persuade the center. No, campaigns now are about mobilizing the base, because the question is the question is, look, if you're a voter and you're going to vote, you're going to come out and vote for this or that party. So we want to energize you and mobilize you, tell you where your polling place is, get you energized to vote. And that's how you ultimately win elections. Trying to go into the middle persuadable voter, where there's probably only like 5% or 4% of voters who actually might go another way. It's really about energizing the base, which you do have, and getting them out to vote. So look, I think Bernie Sanders is the best to do that. So the idea that Klobuchar has, that by running to the center, she's ultimately going to be able to persuade moderate voters, really is an outdated campaign strategy, which honestly, look, it might have worked, 30 or 40 years ago, but we're in a different era now. We're in a different world where people are polarized, and you can criticize that and say, hey, look, maybe we shouldn't be so polarized or blah, 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 blah. And there's all kinds of different structural, options which you might be able to do to change that. But that's where we are. That's the world that we're in right now. And Bernie Sanders, in terms of electability, in terms of being able to bring out more voters, is going to be the candidate who's going to be able to do that, as opposed to an Amy Klobuchar who isn't going to be able to excite the base, and by trying to appeal to moderate centrist voters who aren't going to vote for you anyway, it's going to be ultimately a failed campaign strategy. It's not ultimately going to work. You have to mobilize your base in order to win. And the last thing I'll just talk about real quick is that absolutely ridiculous claim at the end there by Zimmerman, which Anna Kasparian rightly criticizes him for, is the idea that, oh, Klobuchar is out here trying to advocate for structural change. And, you'll notice Zimmerman there criticizes Anna by saying, no, look, it's just not true that Klobuchar isn't out here advocating structural change. Of course she is. She just has a different view. No, Klobuchar has no serious intentions of actually changing the system, actually changing the structure. But of course, the interesting observation to be made here is that the question of what constitutes the system is itself an ideological question, right? For Klobuchar, for Biden, for Buttigieg, for moderates, for centrists itself, the central question of what the structure is, it contains a distinction between public and private. But for Democratic Socialists and for Bernie Sanders and the like, the interesting distinction is not public and private, but who holds power over whom and where and why, right? And what is the structure of that power? Is that power democratically organized, or is it not democratically organized? And that's why Bernie Sanders, when making the criticism, hey, look, you take money from 40 billionaires, so no, of course you're not going to ultimately change the system. That's why that critique lands, because it's a critique of the very distinction between public and private. And Bernie Sanders leveling that critique, I think, and the fact that it lands as a legitimate critique, I think does show the hollowness of the centrist approach, of the corporate approach to politics. I mean, the very idea, I've talked about this before on this channel, the very idea of centrism is itself a corporate ideology, in that the very distinction is itself a question of how much government intervention do you want into the economy. It assumes that the economy is natural, and it assumes that government is an intervention into it, right? Think about the state of nature, and then you have a social contract to develop a government. So the economy is natural, and you're developing a social contract through some kind of compact, using economic terms in order to make that contract to decide how much government intervention you want. That's the ideology of centrism. There are some social contract doctrines which are more to the left, but personally, I'm critical of even those. But my point that I want to make is that centrism is itself an ideology. What you constitute as the center, what you constitute or consider to be the structure, is an ideological question. And so for Zimmerman just to turn around and say, oh, well, of course Klobuchar wants structural change, that's because for him, the interesting question, anytime you make structural change, is always going to be dabbling around the edges, because it's never actually attempting to challenge that central postulate of that centrist ideology, which is that public and private, that weird public and private distinction, when the real question is who holds power over whom, how and why is that power democratically organized? The market is an institution, right? That's the important thing to keep in mind. The market is an institution. Do we want the market democratically organized, or do we want it to dominate us? And that's why Bernie Sanders' critiques are so ultimately effective. Anyway, I've kind of gone on a bit of a rant there. So if you like the video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.